OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODAloop.com.
Hi, I'm Matt DeVoe, and thanks for joining the OODAcast. Today we have Bilyana Lilly joining us, who is a prolific author, researcher, and expert in the field. So, Bilyana, thanks for joining us, and would love for you to give the audience kind of your origin story. What is your background, and how did you wind up in this field?
Thank you for inviting me, Matt. Origin story. So I'm originally from Bulgaria. I was born in a very small town that probably very few people have heard of, and that's totally fine. It's called Ruse, and it's next to Romania. And I was a very restless child. And I was, yeah, probably like a lot of us.
Hmm.
While I was in high school, I was already painting a lot. I was doing martial arts professionally with the local police department, and I was also working at the Red Cross. So every day after school, I had something lined up. And it wasn't really typical for people from my town to go abroad during the period I was growing up. But somehow, because of everything I was doing, every summer throughout high school, I somehow ended up in an international summer camp or representing the Red Cross at a competition in Austria or working with the Red Cross in the Netherlands to try to understand how they take care of their orphans better. Or I was sent several times abroad to paint and to basically go to Germany or Romania with my paintings through UNESCO because I apparently they liked what I was doing. So every summer I would go somewhere and I loved it. And while a lot of my peers were just afraid to even go out of my town, I was like, every summer I was looking forward to something. And I made so many friends. I had pen pals from the Czech Republic, the US, Germany. And when it became time for me to decide what I wanted to do after high school, my parents are not wealthy. They are both doctors in Bulgaria. So I had two really big passions, painting and foreign policy. And it turned out the kind of the private lessons that I needed in order to get into architecture school in Bulgaria were too expensive for my parents. So I ended up doing the SAT on my own without any lessons, and then going to an international school that gave me a scholarship. So because I couldn't really get like the money to go to and apply to an architecture school in Bulgaria, I ended up on a foreign policy path in Germany. And then from there, I did a little bit of math, statistics. I loved computers, but that wasn't my focus at the time. I focused more on conflict and international humanitarian law and foreign policy. And I'd say one of the moments that really defined my path was a summer spent in Kosovo, and I was so random. Someone just came to me and handed me a sheet of paper saying, Bilyana, you know, the Netherlands here, this organization is sponsoring students to go to Kosovo for a summer, and they're giving basically university credit. Would you like to go? And it's all paid for. I'm like, sure. And I had no idea what I was doing. I ended up being taught international humanitarian law by, I still remember his name, Curtis Dubler, who was an American who was representing Saddam Hussein at the time. He was his lawyer, and it was fascinating to learn about Kosovo and Serbia just a few years after Serbia bombed Kosovo, and that's why we were there. Basically, the government of Kosovo was trying to attract international attention and bring more foreigners to the country and try to restart foreign policy and economics and everything. And while I was studying with this super interesting guy representing Saddam Hussein, and I kept on thinking like, why are you representing the devil? Like, we know very well what he's done. Like, how can you do this? And I started learning a lot about conflict and the different complexities of conflict. And I saw every morning I was going to school, I saw bombed out churches, I saw hospitals not working, electricity wasn't working. Several years after the war, the country still wasn't functional. Kosovo was still a mess. So after that experience, I decided I want to do foreign policy and I want to work for the United Nations. So I went to Geneva, another school. I did my first master's there. They again gave me a scholarship. So surprise, I managed to go there and had a fantastic 3 years in Switzerland. And I worked for the United Nations for a bit. And I randomly wrote a paper because the topic was interesting on nuclear terrorism originating from Russia, which attracted the attention of some Russians. And I didn't know it at the time, but the person that really liked my writing turned out to be very good friends with Anatoly Antonov, who was Russia's deputy minister of defense, and then he was also the ambassador of Russia to Washington, D.C. at some
Mm.
point. So that person liked my paper and invited me to a conference in Moscow. And I ended up going and presenting my paper next to the Russian generals who negotiated the START treaty on one side, and on the other, the US guys that represented the United States during the START treaty. And I was this 20-year-old, knowing nothing, researcher student, and I was in that environment already. So that was super fascinating and interesting to me. And then I went to England after Geneva because Oxford has always been a dream, and they accepted me for a second master's just focused on Russia and missile defense. And I went there on a great scholarship and spent 2.5 years at Oxford. And afterwards, I moved to the States because from the experience in Geneva and from the experience of Oxford, I very much realized that if I wanted to be focused on foreign policy and decision making, those decisions, the really important decisions, aren't made at the United Nations and they aren't made at Oxford. They're made in the capitals of the decision
Mm.
makers, which are the US, China, and Russia. And I thought from the three, where do I want to end up? China and Russia, not so much. So I decided, okay, the US it is. A democracy, a healthy state, market based economy, let's go. So I ended up in Washington, D.C., and from there, I did a PhD at the Rand Corporation. And at the time, Russia's interference in the 2016 elections happened. And I initially thought I'm going to write about the hardcore military issues, tanks and bombs. And when that happened, I realized, oh my God, this is our next type of, this is the modern warfare today. The Russians are not going to cross into the United States with the tanks. They are not going to shoot the ICBMs. Hopefully not. We have the deterrence pretty well established there. Hopefully that will be the last letter of escalation that we never get to, but they will continue to attack us in cyberspace through cyber operations, through disinformation campaigns, through psychological warfare, everything that's around that doctrine. And I thought, this is fascinating. I want to focus on this. And ever since, that has been my focus.
Wow. Which culminated in your, was it your thesis that you published into a book? So tell us a little bit about the Russian information warfare book.
That's right. So it all started with the 2016 elections and the interference in the elections. And as I was watching the media and how the US media represented the problem, I thought it was very uneducated, and I was a
Mm.
little bit kind of disappointed with US approach because a lot of the media outlets started talking about the issue and saying, oh, this is an unprecedented hack. This is basically when two Russian APTs hacked into the Democratic National Committee and the sister agency, the DCCC, and then leaked information about Hillary Clinton's campaign, some internal problems, and then John Podesta's emails also made it to public forums. So that particular hack and leak operation, afterwards we call it hack and leak, our media started talking about how this is unprecedented and the Russian, they really didn't, it unexpected. I'd say that that word, when that word was used, I was very disappointed because I've been studying the Russian playbook for over 10 years at that point, and I knew that the Russian government has been doing these types of operations in other countries already. And Estonia, Finland, even Russia domestically, they usually test their tactics closer to the capital. Like we have Chechnya, we have Georgia, we have countries on the periphery of Russia that have had conflicts with Russia for decades, and then they tend to export it. So Estonia, Finland, Sweden are countries that have been dealing with psychological warfare and cyber attacks for a lot longer than the US has from Russia. And then the Russian government tends to come to the West. So it's like a wave that eventually reaches us. So when I saw how the US government responded to Russia, and I'm very much, I know a lot of the people that were in that administration, and I understand their decision making at that time. They didn't want to provoke the Russian government. They didn't want the Obama administration to appear to appear too biased when it supports the Clinton campaign at the time. But
Mhm.
I think we could have been a lot harsher with our responses to Russia at the time. And over time, there were certain responses, like different members of the Obama administration talked to their counterparts in Russia and warned them that they should stop conducting disinformation operations, hacking against different parts of the political campaign of Hillary Clinton. But this wasn't enough. And I think understanding that to me was very important. and I decided I wanted to focus my PhD at Rand on understanding where else has Russia conducted similar attacks and how are cyber operations a part of Russia's general playbook and what is this called. And basically this culminated in my PhD in Russian information warfare, where I looked at different cases where the Russian government has used cyber operations, disinformation, in some cases assassinations, and even the Russian government even tried to assassinate a prime minister of a European country to achieve its objectives. And I looked at all of these cases and created a playbook of Russian information warfare, on the basis of which then I started to explain, okay, now that we understand the beast and the threat, what are the measures that we can take at each step to make sure that we prevent these operations and mitigate their effects? So this is how the book came about.
Excellent. Yeah, and highly recommended to those. I'll make sure we include a link so folks can pick up a copy. My
Great.
copy, as you know, is at the office, so I can't hold it up here in front of the camera, but we'll make sure people know where to find it. Um, as you analyze the 2016 election interference, where would you put it on the spectrum of Russian influence psychological operations? Was it kind of like mid tier? Was it lower mid tier? Or what was the level of sophistication and the level of intensity compared to what you saw in some of these other countries?
That's a great question. I'd say that it was, we weren't really prepared.
Mm,
So the IRA, so Russia used several different activities. So they used the Internet Research Agency that was based in St. Petersburg, which literally had people employed, and they were going from 9 to 5 as like regular employees
yeah.
to troll us, literally to troll Americans, to create fake accounts on social media, and they did that on Facebook, Twitter at the time, now X, and Reddit and LinkedIn, and basically spread disinformation or extremely polarizing messages to the constituency to try to influence us. Now we'll catch that. Now we have, but also now they have changed. There are Russian troll farms in different countries and all of that. So at the time, I'd say the Russian methods weren't that sophisticated, but also we didn't know where to look. If you remember, after the election, even it took several months for research to come out about the scope of Russia's disinformation campaign at the time. We didn't know that Russians were on Facebook. We didn't know that they were pretending to be Americans at the time as they were doing this towards just months before the 2016 elections. So we didn't know. And they could get away with it because we just didn't know where to look. On the side of the cyber operations, if you remember, the DNC also they had one IT person. There was a great article in the New York Times. I think David Sanger wrote it about how the guy kept on getting calls from the FBI, and the FBI is telling him, "Hey, you have Russian APTs on your network. You have to address this." And he was hanging up on them because he didn't think that he thought that this was some sort of a scam, and they were tricking him. And
Mhm.
the FBI agent eventually had to walk physically to the DNC offices, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, you need to pick up the phone and hear what I'm saying because you have fancy bear and cozy bear in your networks." So I think, and they were tripping over each other. And this is one of the examples where we started talking about, do like Russian GRU or FSB, do they talk to each other in SVR or not? But at the time, I think perhaps they didn't care about getting caught as much as they do now. And I think that also played to their advantage. We again weren't prepared to deal with the cyber operations that they particularly executed. But a lot of it was also based on luck, I think, from the Russian government perspective, because I don't think they knew what they were going to find in the GNC networks. I don't think they knew what they're going to find on Podesta's among Podesta's emails that was that incendiary and interesting
Sure.
for the voters. So I think on their side it was a lot of trial and error and luck, and on our side it was just myopic understanding of Russia's playbook and us, and I mean by us, the U.S. government, we just weren't
Mhm.
prepared. So I think that's why the operation, from the perspective of the Russian government, the operation was a success. I don't really think that they expected Trump to win. And if you remember, I even had friends that were pro Hillary Clinton, they were Democrats. And when we finally heard the result of the elections, people were shocked. I remember even I was doing my PhD at Rand, and we had a 1 week imposed vacation by our professors to just to mourn the election outcome, because so many of my PhD candidate colleagues were so upset they
Mhm.
couldn't go to class. So we
Wow.
even had that. which was very interesting to me. I experienced that. I guess people really take the election outcomes very seriously here,
Mm,
for a good reason. So I think we just weren't prepared, and I think ever since, our policies and understanding of Russia's different malicious activities against us around elections, but also continuously against the United States, we understand them better. We have better policies to address them, and the Russian government also has adapted as a result.
mm. Um, it's sad to hear that they had a mandatory week's vacation. That seems almost like a sad statement for democracy that folks are so emotionally invested in the process that they feel like that's necessary to do. Um, it strikes me going back to 2016. Then I want to fast forward a little bit. Um, I interviewed on this podcast a couple years ago Michelle Walker, who wrote this great book called The Gray Rhino. And for those that aren't familiar, the gray rhino is the analogy that she used for the risk that is staring you in the face. We all understand and know about black swans, which are the unexpected, the things you can't predict. But Michelle calls the gray rhino those things that we can predict, but we don't confront. There was a large body of work, as you alluded to, by Tim Thomas and by folks at RAND around Russian information operations, psychological operations, reflexive control, kind of all those kind of elements that were in Russian doctrine. So, why do you think that it was a gray rhino for us? Do you have any feelings as to why the US wasn't prepared? Because we certainly knew that that type of operation was coming into the United States eventually and had known it for 20 years prior to that.
And Matt, thank you for this. I have some thoughts, but before that, I want to make a shameless plug here for your master thesis too. You wrote about those trends already decades ago,
Yeah.
not only Rand. So your thesis should be the one that we talk about here too. If no one has interviewed you on this podcast, we have to do that
Okay.
because
Well,
I
I'll
think it's
invite
very
you
present.
back. We can flip the tables, and next time you can interview me and we can talk about the thesis and some of that
I
stuff.
think that would be really cool. All
Yeah.
right. So why did we not were we not prepared? I think first of all, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of communism, I think the United States shifted focus, and for a good reason. We had
Mm,
9/11.
yeah.
We had other threats to deal with, and in the 90s, there was this understanding and this hope that Russia is really changing. We had a warming of relations between then Yeltsin and Clinton. There was even a video I still remember, both of them joking and hugging each other. You
Mm,
couldn't have imagined that beforehand. And a lot of we had delegations from the United States going to Russia, teaching Russia about the market economy and how to move away from the centrally controlled communist structured economy and going away from those patterns and opening up the country to Western investment. And I think we thought that the threat was gone.
mm,
But then what we didn't take into account, and by we I mean the U.S. government and also NATO
mm.
in general, or the Western countries in NATO. I think the Baltics and Poland never really fell asleep to the danger because they had way too much experience with the
Sure.
World War II and how Russia treated them, so they knew better. But I think we thought that Russia could change, and we ignored the fact that a lot of the old guards, the people that were from the GRU, from the FSB, from the Siloviki in general, their military forces, their intelligence forces, they were the same people that had the Cold War mentality and were trained during the Cold War, and they didn't go away. They still stayed in the institutions that transitioned from the communist period to the democratic period, or this period in the 90s in Russia. And then I think we also fail to take into account the change from Yeltsin to Putin and how Russia domestically reacted to that. I think the Russian people, to a large extent, welcomed that change, and because they saw Yeltsin as weak, as giving too much freedom to the regions in Russia, and they saw Putin's centralization and control back of the country, they saw it as a positive sign because they were disillusioned with the oligarchs plundering of natural resources of different industries. And in the 90s, they saw Putin, or the early 2000s, they saw Putin as this needed force in the country to unite it back.
Mm, mm,
And I think from there, then we had disagreements over how we fight the war on terror. Initially, there was the first president that called George Bush after 9/11 was Putin.
mm,
And there was even this, I've read it, it was very weird at the time, I thought, but the Kremlin or the Russian government tried to position itself as an ally of the United States to fight against global jihad altogether.
Mhm.
And it's like they had this very short statement that they put on the Kremlin's website. It was something about the civilized world against the barbaric world, and we have to unite together. Ta-da-da. They tried that strategy,
Mhm.
but then Russia got disillusioned because it realized it couldn't be an equal partner to the West or to the United States, and for a good reason. Russia wasn't a great power. If we look at economic size, if we look at influence, the U.S. was leading Russia by a lot, but the Russian government really wanted an equal partner status, and it didn't receive it. So I think we kind of shifted our focus to other threats,
Yeah.
but Russia didn't,
Do you
and I
think
think
the
that's one.
oh good. Yeah, I was
Hmm.
gonna say, do you think the Russian government's support for the global war on terror was also to buy themselves some room for what they would declare as counterterrorism operations in Russia? So it seems like it's a little
Absolutely,
bit self-serving. I mean, I get the fact that they wanted to offer the support, they wanted to be viewed as an equal, and we're not. But I think it also normalized wars on terror, right? Which they would then
absolutely.
flip in their society. So do you think that came into play as well?
Absolutely. Chechnya, Dagestan, Tatarstan, those separatist republics that have
Mm,
wanted to become independent from Russia for a long time, absolutely. And this has been a problem during the Chechen wars. The Russians were quite cruel to those regions. They invaded. They were very indiscriminately trying to suppress the threat by killing civilians and combatants. And they I'd say they attracted a lot of international criticism towards because of those activities. And I think you're absolutely spot on here that they try to justify some of those actions by taking advantage of what happened in the United States.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it allowed them to build a framework for those types of operations, it felt like. Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
Cool. I want to start fast forwarding in time and eventually get to the 2024 election, but in between, I think we need to acknowledge and talk about the conflict in Ukraine because we now obviously have a kinetic conventional warfare taking place. What surprised you, or how would you characterize the cyber operations component of the conflict with Ukraine?
It's a great question, Matt. So the war is still ongoing, right?
Mm,
And we're getting patchy information about, I don't think we're really getting a clear overall picture of the types of operations because the Ukrainian government still has incentives to not disclose everything. And we have a number of companies publishing cyber threat intelligence reports. So I think we're still gathering, uh, building our overall picture of how exactly cyber has been used during the war. But from what I can see so far, and to be clear, the war started in 2014.
mm,
When Russia annexed
sure.
Crimea, the
Yeah.
war started ever since. We have the little green men all over eastern Ukraine. They've been trying to take territory for a long time. And what we saw in February of 2022 was an escalation of that war that has started already in 2014. But let's talk about since 2022 onwards. I think overall, cyber operations have been in support of the major conventional military efforts. And I think they could be used as a predictor of some of those efforts going forward. And Ukraine is not the only case. We saw this in Georgia as well,
Mm,
where you have cyber operations, specifically DDoS attacks, you have defacement campaigns, you have prepositioning of malware before the actual invasion. And the goal of that is to try to established, they call it information superiority in cyberspace and over the communications and command and control lines so that when the conventional war activity starts, then the enemy or the targeted state is as incapacitated as possible and as incapable of conducting decision making and fighting back as possible. So they see this as cyber operations are a part to take over the communications networks and weaken the enemy before they come in with conventional forces. And we saw that with the biggest waves of DDoS attacks just hours before the actual invasion and then during the actual invasion. So we had that as something interesting, I think. And then we had a lot of focus on, or there was a shift in focus towards cyber operations being used to try to disrupt civilian critical infrastructure, from telecommunications to energy facilities. We had an attempt to again turn off the electricity for several million Ukrainians several times, and in Destroyer 2, there was the malware used there. ESET helped again as they did in the first. in
Mhm.
the first attempt to prevent the actual disruption. And recently, what we are seeing is cyber operations being used more in a strategic way to further frontline operations and objectives on the front line. For example, by trying to penetrate the phones of soldiers to figure out where the soldiers are located, where the troops are, where the movements are going, and where, for example, drones are, where artillery is, where air force air defenses are. So they're using cyber operations in a more strategic way to again further the general military campaign.
Interesting. You know, I think from my perspective, I was a little surprised that the critical infrastructure attacks weren't more successful, right? When we
Yeah.
regarded Russia as having a more sophisticated capability. So, do you think, and obviously we'd be speculating, but do you think that they held back on the cyber attacks against infrastructure, or were we over assessing their capabilities and they just didn't have the ability to penetrate the defenses that included kind of the collective research, as you mentioned, with ESET and others?
hmm I think maybe a part of the answer would be why hack something when you can bomb it? You know that
Mm-hmm.
to preposition malware, do a reconnaissance the network, preposition malware, stay there and detect it. It takes months, and
Mm-hmm.
they've done this in a few cases. But if they can just strike the facility and impact it in a much more disruptive way, just for conventional warfare, why bother with cyber operations? I think in some during peacetime, cyber operations are a very effective way to disrupt the country. But during war, the alternatives I think are more effective. There are alternatives that are faster and as effective or more effective than a cyber attack. So I'd say that they have probably, if we think of cyber warfare in relation to the other types of, of military activities that they could use to achieve their objectives during war, I think cyber becomes less effective in those disruptive operations, and the shift is more towards let's try to gather information, collect intelligence about the movements of the troops, and try to use cyber operations in combination with disinformation to impact the the mentality of soldiers in the entire country. I think it maybe I'm wrong, but I'd love to see actually someone analyzing the data and creating a really good analysis of this to see. But I think my hunch is telling me that during war, cyber is more effective as a tool of psychological warfare than as a tool of disruption. What do you think?
Interesting. Yeah, it's funny because I walked around the Pentagon prior to the second Iraq conflict with the United States after 9/11, making the opposite argument, which was let's engage in cyber attacks instead of using bombs. And my reasoning then was that it's less destructive. You have less impact on the civilian population. So I guess if we look at it, with Russia intentionally choosing to use the bombs, maybe it's that they're being a bit more cruel. They don't want the civilian population to get the infrastructure back. They want it to have a more lasting impact. Where my viewpoint back then was that I wanted to be able to take the power grid down and then go in and get the occupying force there, but then bring the power grid back up so that you could have schools and hospitals and kind of a functioning society. And that is probably not a priority for Russia. Um, so it is a little bit more of that kinetic having the more lasting impact and a harder impact on the
Yeah,
population. So there's kind of a cruel disregard there, I think. So
yeah,
if we make that assumption that they're just choosing to bomb things, do you think that they still do have a sophisticated cyber capability as it relates to targeting critical infrastructure if they wanted to? Was that an option or kind of an arrow in their quiver?
yeah.
Or, do you think that they're going to, rely on the conventional type attacks in the future as well?
Yeah, and by the way, I applaud your thinking. You're thinking like a strategic American and strategist in general. I wish that was how Putin was thinking, but
Hmm.
from what I'm reading about the war, I think the Russians are a little, not a little worried, but it hasn't gone according to their plan, and they're fighting a war of attrition with an unclear outcome. And I believe right now the goal is to weaken Ukraine as much as possible to bring them to the negotiating table because both sides are experiencing massive losses and a lot of
Sure.
pressure from their domestic constituencies, but also internationally. So I think the 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 careful discrimination between combatants and civilians right now is not a priority for the Russian government as much as we'd love it to be. And
Yeah.
we've seen this like with the massacres already several years ago in Ukraine, where they're just going through cities and killing everyone, burning them in mass graves. They have been disgustingly cruel towards a country that is like-minded and is supposed to be a part of Russia,
Mm.
according to their thinking. So I think the whole idea of discriminating civilians versus combatants is just, it's been long not a priority. Whether they have still the capabilities, the sophisticated capabilities, it'll be, we're hypothesizing on this, right?
Mhm.
But if I look at what they have been losing over the past few years, I'd say I'm not really sure, because they lost a lot of their IT forces. Already during the period where Putin announced partial mobilization, we saw so many Russians leave Russia because they were scared. They didn't want to go to the front lines and fight. We had over, different estimates says say between 500 and a million Russians fled the country. And I don't know much if you followed. I was literally looking at some the air flights and the maps,
Mhm.
and they were like the prices of tickets skyrocketed because everyone wanted to get on a plane to Turkey or
Sure.
Greece and just leave. And at some point the Russian government even said no, you can't leave. They closed the airports. That was
Mhm.
terribly scary. And we saw like lines with cars trying to go through the border with Georgia and Finland. And some estimates that I've read say that about 10% of Russia's IT force fled the country in that period.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, the people that actually have the ability to get up and leave and have a plan to escape, those are probably abroad. Those are probably the educated individuals that have high paid jobs in the IT sector. So I imagine a lot of their basically cybersecurity talent fled the country. The ones
Mhm.
that were somehow already tied with the FSB and the GRU probably couldn't leave as easily, but I would imagine a lot of them did. So, based on that and what we've seen in Ukraine and the types of operations we've seen, I'd say they're probably overstretched right now.
Mhm.
And their focus is still Ukraine. And I believe they've become, since we haven't seen a lot of these disruptive attacks against critical infrastructure lately, perhaps if they have sophisticated tools, they're holding them back for a period where using them will be more effective than it is right now. And I imagine they're focused more on rebuilding and replenishing their cyber talent and capabilities than on using them at the
Mhm.
moment.
Okay, so there's been some atrophy just by nature of people avoiding the conflict and
That's what I
yeah,
think.
and deterioration. Interesting.
Yeah. And again, those numbers we're getting, they're not accurate. This is
Sure.
the best estimates that I've seen.
Yeah.
There's the Russian government is also reporting numbers. I don't believe them. I don't even believe the Ukrainian numbers because both of them have incentives
Mhm.
eh, to
To
exaggerate
exaggerate.
or
Yeah.
exactly or do exactly the opposite. So I usually take an average of whatever the Ukrainians and the Russians are saying. I go in the middle.
Yeah, probably a safe bet. Interestingly, we saw during that time in which the IT people were fleeing Russia, a decline in cybercrime activity in Russia as well, right? Until those displaced persons were able to get back. So there was a criminal element that was relocating as well, which is interesting. Um,
Or being appropriated by the FSB and being told, hey, if you
yes,
don't
yeah,
hack for us in Ukraine, then your
yeah,
parents are going to go to prison or
yeah,
you'll never see them again.
yeah. Or hack for us by
Absolutely.
day and hack for yourself by night. Um,
That's right.
Interesting. So we're less than 100 days from the US election. There's lots of thematics from a influence psychological operations perspective with a shift in the candidate in the
Yeah.
Democratic Party with a failed assassination against a Republican candidate. What do you think that we'll see out of Russia over the next 100 days by way of trying to impact and influence the US election process again?
That's a great question. So if we look at what Russia has been doing over the past few months, they've been very busy in Europe. 2024 is the year of elections. Most of the more than half, I believe, of the democratic world votes this year. We had elections in India, the UK, we had the EU parliamentary elections, and the Russians were very busy. There are several really good campaigns that have been discovered of basically the Russian government has been trying to influence politicians. So in addition to there are at least 20 different Russian state-sponsored media in different European countries that are spreading Russian propaganda and disinformation. So disinformation is definitely continuing to be one of the aspects that we're going to see in the States as well. But the second is those subtle connections with politicians that worry me the most. And the Russians have been doing that in Europe for decades. And
Mm,
it's very hard to track because some countries don't require transparency with regards to political funding for parties or individuals.
mm,
And we have examples in Montenegro, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in France. Even Le Pen was sponsored by the Russians. Le Front National was sponsored by the
mm,
Russians, and they still have serious ties with the Russian government. So, and recently there was another campaign in the Czech Republic. There was this media outlet that turned out to be run by an Ukrainian oligarch who is very close to the Putin family. I believe Putin is the godfather of his daughter or one of his daughters, and he had this media supposedly to provide a platform for the right wing movements in or right wing political parties in Europe. But it turned out that he not only provided them an outlet for them to express their opinion, he was also financially sponsoring a number of politicians in the UK, Germany, France for that outlet. And that campaign, I believe it was called the Voice of Europe campaign was the type of the
mm,
website that they were using, and then this was called the Voice of Europe campaign, through which they tracked, and by they I mean law enforcement services in different European countries
mm,
track the financing from Russia to the local politicians, and the goal was to influence the parties and the elections in those countries, but also to influence the EU elections. So I would say that that worries me with regards to the United States, where our politicians are getting their funding from, how exactly those connections with Russia work. And I always worry when I see a political representative aligning their perspective with that of Russia. I
mm.
always worry that there may be some incentive and a second agenda that is not necessarily American.
Right. Two things come to mind. So I'll ask the first one. It seemed, in 2016, again in 2020, that a lot of the misinformation campaigns were focused on the institution of elections and trust in the electoral process and the outcome of elections. Do you think that we'll see similar campaigns going into 2024? Because it's an even more of a hot button issue, it seems like this year than it was in 2020 or 2022.
Oh, absolutely. The erosion of legitimacy of our institutions and trust in our institutions, I think, is more dangerous than hatred for one party or the other, because
Mhm,
to me, as someone, I grew up in a communist society, and I make a differentiation between the system and the process or the content, the political parties. I'm okay with people arguing and protesting peacefully about the political candidates. And even if Trump wins, let's say, because I am a supporter of Ukraine, I think we should continue to support Ukraine in the fight against Russia. I think the US should continue to contribute to NATO. So, on a number of issues, I don't agree with the Republican Party right now. But for me, if he wins and democracy perseveres, that's fine, because that's the will of the people. And this
mhm,
means that the accountability, the process, the election process, and democracy is still stable and resilient because it it allows for a peaceful transition
mhm,
to a political party that represents the majority of our constituency. But if we start talking about how we don't trust our institutions and fight against or protest against the legitimacy of the election, like we did on January the 6th, that is the scariest type of impact from disinformation, in my opinion. When people start questioning the resiliency of the system and the democratic governance as a process. And to that end, I'm specifically worried that if we have another democratic win this year, we can see another January 6th type of protest or
mhm,
movement,
mhm,
because the Trump campaign is again, of course, I think predictably, most likely, let's say most likely, let's not be completely certain, but most likely is going to argue that the election process was illegitimate, somehow votes were rigged, and the American constituency has to pick up arms and forcefully change the government.
And the Russian playbook in that circumstance would just to be to reinforce that messaging, right? To help
Exactly.
deteriorate that trust. Yeah.
Exactly. And it will be really difficult to understand and assess with any methodological rigor if the Russian government's disinformation and propaganda efforts around that narrative and discourse have been successful or not, and where exactly their message comes and our domestic activism starts. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to design any policies against disinformation. We just haven't really been able to accurately assess where it comes from and its effects.
Mhm. No, so the second item I wanted to ask was, you mentioned in 2016 we were just caught a little flat-footed. We didn't understand kind of the troll armies and the bot armies, and we've built tools and the platforms have gotten more effective. It's not that those have gone away, but that we've gotten better at managing them.
Hmm.
In 2019, I wrote a little essay around, that the tactics would shift on behalf of Russia away from the bots and more towards the sponsorship or support of legitimate voices, so real
Yes,
people that aligned with their mission. And that might be in the form of let's sponsor their podcasts, let's sponsor their blogs, let's make it so that they can make a living or maybe even a lucrative living at promoting some of these ideals that Russia wants to reinforce. Do you think that that concern is overstated, or is that something that we should be worried about as well? So not the influence on the politicians, but the influence on the influencers themselves, the real human beings that have the voice, can go on TV, can be affiliated with real identities.
Matt, this is something we should be seriously worried about, and the Russians have been doing this for 30 years already in Bulgaria.
Mhm.
We have journalists that are nationally acclaimed journalists for national newspapers that have been receiving a paycheck from Russia for years. And that is even known, and they still advocate for Russia's playbook, and they have been literally bought. One of their salaries comes from the Russian government.
Mhm.
And of course then their articles will be pro-Russian. So yes, I think this is a major vulnerability. I don't know if we can say vulnerability, but definitely a risk and a threat. And I think a way to tackle this perhaps would be to also have some restrictions around the type of funding that an influencer can receive or a radio host can receive. Although this then touches upon so many freedoms
Yeah.
and our democratic process, and this will be really difficult to justify, but I think if we link it to national security and explain clearly the negative effects of disinformation and foreign interference in their own work, then perhaps we can get to a solution where we prevent that funding from affecting them.
Yeah, it's such a difficult proposition because, as you mentioned, it's hard to tell what is legitimate money and what is not. I did a project last year with Kristen Del Rosso, looking at sanctioned persons or Russian government ownership of land and entities. And, the one use case that we went through and covered, it went through 6 layers of obfuscation until you identified kind of the ultimate beneficial owner, right? So we're not structured to look at, oh, is the supplement company that's advertising on this podcast owned by a trust that's owned by a LLC that goes to Cyprus, right? It's too much work. So, I worry that we won't get the sunlight that we need on kind of those sources of funding that are
Exactly.
creeping into the system. So,
Exactly. And they've been doing this again for decades.
yeah,
It is nothing new. We just
sure.
exactly, you're right. I don't think we have enough resources to 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 dedicate to investigating properly the sources of funding,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is a huge problem. And the Russians know it, and that's why their playbook is so successful.
yeah. Yeah, definitely, definitely something I think we're seeing it now, and I think we're going to continue to see it. And it's, obviously I flagged it in 2019, so I was seeing it then in some of these use cases, or what I had hypothesized were instances of that, legitimate voices that were seemingly making a lot of money,
Yeah.
and the source of that funding was not clear, though. Um,
One thing when you mentioned what types of operations we may see around the elections, another trend that I don't think we've discussed yet, but I don't know if we're going to see it, Perhaps I see the Russians using cyber operations as a part of psychological warfare
Mm,
more and more because let's say if they don't have their teammates to us to dedicate time into investigating against or investigating again where in our election system they can hack and what information they can expose and so on. um, we've seen examples of hack and leak informations of slightly different type. Like for example, when the Russian, what was it, Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, hacked into a water facility in Texas. And then they also released a video on their Telegram channel. This was, I believe, earlier this year,
mm,
showing supposedly how they're hacking into the water facility. And imagine that's a similar type of operation where they had some disruptive effects. They didn't affect lives.
mm,
The cyber operation was contained. But imagine a cyber operation and a video of that then being proliferated through social media. And imagine that is done against a polling station or some other element of the election infrastructure, and the information
sure.
is spread on election day. And it's not a deep fake. Maybe it's a
Mm,
deep fake, but imagine it's real.
yeah.
And then the narrative is that hey, elections are being rigged because you see in this one instance the Russian government is hacking our election station and changing votes in one, let's say, polling station, and then from there you spread distrust about the entire election and panic, and maybe people don't even go to the polling stations on that day because they will
Mm,
think that their vote wouldn't count or their vote will be changed
mm,
without their consent. So those are, I don't know if this is what the Russians are going to do, but I do expect them to try to influence us if they think that it is more likely that the Democratic candidate would win.
yeah.
But
Interesting. Yeah.
if we continue to see polls in favor of Trump,
Mm.
maybe they don't really need to do anything because the main goal is, what's the main goal? Make sure that funding for Ukraine is cut as soon as
Mm,
possible and we can take over Ukraine, bring Zelensky to the negotiating table, reach some sort of settlement. I think if the election is going in their favor, then why interfere?
yeah.
If they're going to achieve the objective even without having to move a muscle or dedicate any resources to that this time.
Yeah, at times I think they can't resist, right? I think that's when you get back to the KGB heritage, right? It's like they can't resist having the capability and not utilizing it. But maybe they'll think a little bit more strategically as to,
True, but if what they're too busy in Ukraine and they're
yeah,
like, okay, do I spend my 2 hours today or 8 hours today trying to figure out how to break into the DNC, or do I spend my 8 hours today trying to figure out Zelensky's
yeah,
commander or something else
yeah,
here?
yeah, that's a great
So,
point. Yeah,
what do you think was going to happen? Do you have
yeah.
any predictions?
I think we'll see the influence operations that are focused on that creating greater divide between American citizens and particular issues, and obviously the political parties. I think there definitely will be some sort of support around narratives to not trust the institution of elections, regardless of the outcome, just because I think that I call it the disruption of social integrity or kind of the degradation of trust, and Neil Pollard and others and I have written about that as kind of like the trust wars or that being a huge focus of future operations. So I think this
Hmm.
this offers a unique point in time given the division, given the chaos, there's so many moving parts that it's going to be easier than normal to have those types of operations be successful. And I see it. I'm sure you see it in my social media, consumption, and I see it on both sides of the political spectrum. I see misinformation. I see people sharing memes and things that are designed to influence others. You see them showing false information, right? Like we have a huge information quality or a truth deficiency that exists right now and how we're interacting with some of these sites online. So that's definitely a concern. Yeah.
I'm smirking here because I have a really good friend who I respect a lot who keeps on sending me news from X, and I keep on telling him not to because the sources are definitely not the types of sources he should be referencing. But yep,
Yep.
we have a lot of people that don't really take this as seriously as they should.
Yeah.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, for sure. Um, this has been fascinating. Are there any topics, I've got two more questions kind of formally for you. Are there any topics that you think about we should be thinking about in this domain after 2024? Like, what does the landscape look like? Let's assume that the election takes place, there is a winner. that democracy persists and we kind of have a peaceful transition of power. What
hmm
is the playbook at that point in time in targeting the United States?
I think if Trump wins the election and we have a Republican government in power for 4 years, probably we'll see a lot less
Hmm.
of Russia's interference and activities, specifically information warfare activities against the US, because the Trump campaign is going to carry out the Russian agenda. It seems to me that Europe already. I'm the chair of the Democratic Resilience Track at the Warsaw Security Forum, and for 2 years already, I know Europe has been preparing for a potential Republican next government, and Europe has been thinking about how are they going to carry the war in Ukraine forward without U.S.
Hmm.
support. And
Yeah.
there's, I think, then the Russian government's focus will be on Europe because Poland, the Baltic states,
Mm.
the Balkans, they're clearly they they didn't fall asleep in the 90s. They remember what Russian playbook looks like, what Russian ideology is, what political culture from Russia is, and they don't want to see that. So I think Russia will focus all its resources on trying to divide Europe further. France,
Mm.
Germany, the UK, similarly to what they have been doing this year with influencing politicians directly for paying them and so on.
So that's the potential if there's a Republican president. What if there's a Democrat president?
Then they will probably continue to try to influence Congress
Mm.
and support the Republican agenda and trying to perhaps most likely, more like likely, let's say likely, continue to push narratives about Ukraine being corrupt. The assistance that Ukraine receives hasn't been appropriated properly. The Ukrainian leadership is using that assistance for to further their personal objectives to buy yachts and jewelry and all of that. We had several of those examples. So I
Mm.
think they will try to spread messages that erode Americans' trust in Ukraine
Mm.
and reduce our willingness or impact our willingness to support Ukraine with
Mm.
military and humanitarian assistance.
So you think the focus is very regional. They're kind of they would be more targeted with regards to how they think about the United States as it relates to support for Ukraine, as opposed
Absolutely.
to viewing us as sort of some like great power conflict that
Yes.
would be isolated. Interesting.
I think Putin's number one objective is to win the war in Ukraine.
Mm.
Whether that means a peaceful settlement where eastern Ukraine, Donbas, Luhansk, that whole area
Mm.
is under Russian control, or the war continues. But I think he's trying to end the war as well with some sort of positive outcome for
Mm.
Russia.
Clear
I think that's
victory.
the number one exactly.
Yeah. Um, Thank you so much for that perspective. It's always amazing for me to chat with you, so knowledgeable. But I do have one last
Mm.
question that is usually a surprise unless you've watched other episodes, and that is, given how avid a reader I am, what is something that you've read recently by way of a book that you would recommend?
Hmm. I'm afraid of a book, so I have a few right now. I am finishing. Um, There's a Russian book, Война будущего, that I think everyone should read because it's called The War of the Future by two Russian
Hmm.
colonels that describes their view of robotics and information warfare and psychological warfare. But I
Is there an
recently,
English translation of it?
I was about to do one, but the book is more than 200 pages. And I'm like, Bilyana, you're
Okay.
crazy. Focus on your work. But it's really good. Um, what I've started reading lately is actual fiction that is written by experienced either intelligence officers or military
Mhm.
officers from the US because
Mhm.
fiction gives us an opportunity to say what we think and describe in a more
Sure.
engaging for the reader way what a future would look like
Mhm.
if we don't take certain measures. And I'm reading Jim Lawler's book right now, In the
Okay.
Twinkling
Yeah.
of an Eye,
Yep.
and
Yep.
I really like how he's described certain trends, and it allows you to see the tragedy that the Soviet Union was, the tragedy of Chernobyl, the tragedy in North Korea.
Mhm.
I think more of us should write like this. I'm also
Yeah.
trying to actually write a novel right now, and you know that I'm going to send it at some point.
Yep.
I'm still playing with a few characters, but I think because the information warfare playbook has so many targets, and a lot of them are our domestic constituency. A lot of them are people that are not like you and me with cybersecurity background and understanding of foreign policy and the threat that Russia, China, Iran, North Korea pose. I think we need to find a way to convey our message and the urgency of this problem to the average American. I think we have to educate our own constituencies, and I think a way to do this is through Hollywood, through more movies, through pop culture, and through actual literature, novels and thrillers that are entertaining, but also carry a message, convey a message about the threats that we're facing.
Yeah. That's great. Jim's work is great. He also, having been one of the most successful intelligence officers and run some legendary operations, his viewpoints into the nuance of tradecraft and
Yeah,
meeting and recruiting and just phenomenal. And by way of a plug for OODAcast, I have a great interview with Jim actually that I recorded probably about
that's
2 years
great.
ago now. So yeah, I would encourage people to go and watch that. And he gave me kudos for being such a deliberate reader of his books, because I think I picked out some things that others had not picked out in the past.
Nice.
So definitely appreciate those recommendations. And summer for me is a favorite time because you get the new Brad Thor, and there's a bunch of different authors that always produce some sort of summer reading thriller that I've been focused on for 25 years. So it's also one of my favorite times to consume that type of content as well. So excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the OODAcast. I look forward to future conversations. And always, as I mentioned, enjoy getting your perspective on this stuff. You're just so knowledgeable and so well informed. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.